a highway outside Palermo, a judge inside an armored car, a detonator, and half the road disappears. This wasn't revenge. It was a message to the state. You don't decide what order looks like. There is a particular kind of silence that follows institutional failure. Not the silence of ignorance, not the silence of incompetence, the silence of accommodation. The 20th century produced many stories of power wars, revolutions, economic transformations, technological leaps, but beneath those official histories ran a parallel current, quieter, more durable, in many cases, more consequential. Criminal organizations did not emerge from nowhere. They did not flourish despite institutions. In most cases, they flourished because of them, because of gaps, because of alliances, because officials at multiple levels decided that certain arrangements were preferable to disruption. This is not a story about violence. Violence was merely a tool. The real story is about structure, about how criminal enterprises built systems that mirrored and, in some cases, supplanted the governments that were supposed to contain them. 10 organizations, 3 continents, a century of accumulated power. What follows is not a ranking of brutality. It is an examination of institutional reach of how criminal structures embedded themselves into economies, political systems, and the daily lives of ordinary people who often had no idea the arrangement existed. Power doesn't need legitimacy. It needs compliance. The pattern would only become visible later, but it was always there. In post-war Sicily, the formal state arrived late and left early. The First Empire was a shadow state. It didn't replace the state, it outsourced it. The Allied invasion of 1943 moved quickly through the island, and in the process, it relied on local intermediaries, men who knew the terrain, who commanded loyalty in rural areas, and who could facilitate cooperation. Some of those men had affiliations that American military intelligence either overlooked or considered acceptable given the circumstances. At the time, none of this seemed unusual. The Sicilian Mafia, known internally as Cosa Nostra, our thing, had existed in some form since the mid-19th century. It was not, at its origin, primarily a criminal enterprise. It emerged as a system of private enforcement in a region where the Italian state had never fully established legitimacy. Landowners paid for protection. Disputes were resolved through intermediaries. The mafia occupied the space between formal law and practical necessity. By the post-war period, that space had expanded considerably. Sicily received substantial reconstruction funds from the Italian government and from international aid programs. The disbursement of those funds required local contractors, local suppliers, local political figures. The Cosa Nostra understood, before most formal institutions recognized it, that economic reconstruction was an opportunity. Not to steal from it directly, though, that occurred, but to position itself as an indispensable intermediary. Construction contracts were negotiated through mafia-connected brokers. Agricultural subsidies passed through networks with Cosa Nostra affiliations. Political candidates in Palermo and surrounding provinces operated with the understanding that certain endorsements carried obligations. This was not always visible. It was designed not to be. Later, Italian investigators had a phrase for it: a convergence of interests. Not corruption, integration. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the mafia's economic footprint expanded into urban development as Palermo itself grew. The so-called sack of Palermo, a term used by journalists, architects, and eventually prosecutors to describe the destruction of the city's historic urban fabric through unchecked construction, was not purely the result of corrupt municipal officials. Though corruption was present, it reflected a systematic redirection of development resources through mafia-connected networks that had embedded themselves into the municipal approval process. Seen in isolation, each building permit appeared to be a local administrative matter. The pattern would only become visible later. By the 1970s, the Cosa Nostra had evolved again. The global heroin trade offered revenues that dwarfed anything available through domestic extortion. Sicilian networks connected with American Mafia families, particularly in New York, to establish what investigators would eventually call the Pizza Connection, a narcotics distribution pipeline that used pizzerias as front businesses across the northeastern United States. Laundering proceeds back through financial institutions in Switzerland and the Bahamas. The infrastructure was not built overnight. It required trusted intermediaries across multiple jurisdictions, financial mechanisms sophisticated enough to obscure origins, and political protection sufficient to prevent serious interdiction. Italian prosecutors Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, working from Palermo in the 1980s, constructed what became known as the Maxi Trial, a coordinated prosecution of 475 alleged Cosa Nostra members, drawing on the testimony of pentiti, former members who agreed to cooperate with investigators. The 1987 verdict resulted in 338 convictions. It was a structural achievement. It demonstrated that the organization could be prosecuted as a system, not merely as a collection of individual criminal acts. The response came quickly. In 1992, Falcone was killed by a bomb placed under a highway near Palermo. 2 months later, Borsellino was killed by a car bomb outside his mother's apartment building. The murders were not simply acts of revenge. They were communications directed not just at prosecutors, but at the political system. They established, unambiguously, the cost of pursuing the Cosa Nostra as a structural problem rather than a law enforcement matter. When a criminal organization becomes an intermediary for normal life, removing it feels like removing plumbing. That's why the state waited. And that's why the Cosa Nostra could afford patience. The organization contracted under sustained legal pressure, but it did not disappear. According to assessments by Italian anti-mafia investigators published in the early 21st century, the Cosa Nostra retained operational capacity in western Sicily and maintained financial networks extending into legitimate business sectors. Patience, as an organizational strategy, is often underestimated. Rome called it crime. On the island, it often passed as order. 3,000 miles to the west, a different version of the same lesson was being learned. The Second Empire didn't hide in alleys. It hid in contracts. The American Mafia, known to its members as La Cosa Nostra, developed along lines shaped by the specific conditions of early 20th century urban America. The Prohibition era is typically treated as the origin story of American organized crime. This framing is partly accurate and partly misleading. Prohibition provided an extraordinary revenue expansion opportunity, and it did accelerate the consolidation of criminal networks in New York, Chicago, and other major cities. But the structural foundations of the American Mafia were built on something more durable than alcohol. Labor. Stand at a shipping dock in 1950s New York, or a construction site, or a union hall where men voted on contracts they did not negotiate. Control those spaces, and you controlled the city. By the 1930s and into the post-war decades, the American Mafia exercised influence over a range of labor unions, most significantly in the Teamsters Union, the Longshoremen's Unions, and various construction trades. This was not incidental. Labor control was, in practical terms, the most powerful position available in the mid-20th century American economy. Control the union, and you controlled hiring. You controlled work stoppages. You controlled the flow of goods through ports and across roads. You controlled the construction of buildings, the installation of infrastructure, and the timeline of every major project in a given metropolitan area. In New York, 5 crime families, the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno organizations operated through a coordinating body known as the Commission, established in 1931 following a period of violent internal conflict. The Commission was not a government, but it performed governmental functions. It adjudicated disputes, approved major operations, and managed the allocation of territories and revenue streams. This structure was not well understood by law enforcement for decades. Federal investigators initially framed organized crime as a collection of individual criminal enterprises rather than an integrated network. That framing was, in part, a reflection of institutional limitations. For years, the official story wasn't that the mafia was small. It was that admitting its size would implicate too many respectable people. The Kefauver Committee hearings of 1951 brought organized crime before the American public in unprecedented detail. Senator Estes Kefauver's televised hearings documented connections between organized crime figures and politicians at the city and state level across multiple jurisdictions. The hearings produced significant public attention. The institutional response was more muted. It would take until 1970, with the passage of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, for federal prosecutors to have a legal tool specifically designed to prosecute criminal organizations as structures rather than as individual defendants. Prior to RICO, it was possible to convict a mob soldier for a specific crime while leaving the broader network intact. RICO changed the prosecutorial calculus by allowing the organization itself to be charged as a criminal enterprise. The prosecutorial campaigns of the 1980s used RICO to prosecute the commission as a single criminal enterprise. The 1986 commission trial resulted in convictions for the leadership of all 5 New York families. It was a significant moment, but it did not resolve the structural question. The American Mafia contracted significantly through the 1990s and into the 21st century, in part due to sustained prosecution, in part due to generational changes within the organizations themselves, and in part because the economic sectors it had dominated were changing. What remained was a reduced but still operational structure and a set of organizational methods that had demonstrably influenced subsequent criminal enterprises that observed its model from a distance. The template endured even as the original organizations weakened. Some structures outlast the people who built them. That is precisely what makes them dangerous. In America, power didn't need a flag. It needed leverage. By the 1980s, the economics of organized crime were being reshaped by a single commodity: cocaine. In Colombia, power became terror. The Third Empire didn't negotiate with the state. It attacked it. The transformation did not happen gradually. It accelerated in ways that existing law enforcement and intelligence frameworks were not designed to track. And in Colombia, the acceleration produced something that earlier criminal organizations had never attempted: open warfare against the state. The Medellín Cartel, centered in Colombia's second-largest city, emerged from networks of cocaine traffickers who consolidated during the late 1970s and early 1980s. The organization was not a cartel in the traditional sense. It lacked the strict hierarchical structures of the Italian-American organizations. It was, more precisely, a confederation of trafficking operations organized around shared logistics, shared corruption investments, and shared protection arrangements. At its peak in the mid-1980s, the Medellín organization controlled what DEA reporting and congressional testimony of the era described as an overwhelming share of the cocaine entering the United States, some estimates placing it at or near 80% of the market, though the precise figure has been contested by subsequent analysts. The revenues generated were not merely criminal, they were, by some assessments, macroeconomic in scale. This created a problem the state wasn't built to solve. What do you do with money that large? The answer involved financial systems that extended well beyond Colombia: banks in Panama, in the Bahamas, in Luxembourg, and in Florida processed proceeds through layers of legitimate and semi-legitimate business activity. The structure was not improvised. It required financial professionals, legal advisors, and willing institutions at multiple points in the chain. Seen in isolation, each transaction appeared to be routine banking activity. The pattern would only become visible later. But the financial dimension was not what defined the Medellín Cartel's historical significance. What distinguished the organization was its deliberate strategic decision to use violence not as an operational tool, but as a political instrument. The campaign against extradition, the legal mechanism by which the Colombian government could transfer drug traffickers to the United States for prosecution, became the central political objective of the organization's leadership. American courts, unlike Colombian courts of that era, were substantially harder to corrupt. The response was systematic. Judges who ruled in favor of extradition were killed. Presidential candidates who supported extradition were assassinated. Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, who had publicly documented cartel infiltration of Colombian political institutions, was killed in 1984. An Avianca commercial flight was destroyed in 1989, killing 107 people, in what investigators later concluded was an attempt to kill a presidential candidate who was among the passengers. These were not expressions of criminal rage. They were calibrated communications, each directed at a specific institutional target, each designed to establish the cost of opposition. The Colombian government, under sustained attack, at one point entered into a negotiated arrangement with the cartel's leadership regarding prison confinement, an arrangement that, according to subsequent official investigations and journalistic accounts, allowed continued operational control from a custom-built facility rather than genuine incarceration. A prison designed by the prisoner is not a prison. It's a treaty. This moment, a sovereign government negotiating the terms of confinement with an organization it had nominally arrested revealed a kind of state compromise that had not been seen at this scale in the post-war period. The cartel did not ultimately survive. The Colombian state, with significant American intelligence and logistical support, dismantled the organization through the early 1990s. Its principal leadership figures were killed or captured by 1993. But the model they had demonstrated that a sufficiently wealthy criminal organization could force a nation-state into negotiation was observed by organizations in Mexico, in Central America, and elsewhere. The demonstration effect was durable even after the original organization was gone. Terror wasn't the byproduct. It was the negotiating position. 60 kilometers to the south of Medellín, a different organization was drawing its own conclusions. Where Medellín chose spectacle, Cali chose stealth. The Fourth Empire, and for a while, it worked. The Cali Cartel watched the Medellín model and identified its fundamental error. Visibility. Open warfare against the state creates two problems. Simultaneously, it generates unified institutional opposition, and it produces international pressure that governments can no longer resist. The Medellín approach maximized revenue extraction in the short term while systematically degrading the political protection that long-term criminal operations require. The Cali organization, controlled by a small number of families with deep roots in Colombia's Valle del Cauca department, chose a different architecture. They invested not in terror, but in integration. Political campaigns received undisclosed contributions. Media organizations operated under arrangements that shaped coverage in ways not always visible to readers. Legal and financial professionals were retained not merely for specific services, but as structural participants in an ongoing enterprise. Law enforcement relationships were cultivated at multiple levels over extended periods. This required patience. It required the ability to defer immediate tactical advantage in favor of long-term positional strength. According to evidence presented in subsequent prosecutions and reporting by investigative journalists covering Colombian politics in the 1990s, the Cali organization's infiltration of political institutions extended to the financing of a presidential campaign, an allegation that produced a significant political crisis in Colombia in 1994 and 1995, and resulted in a congressional investigation that documented, but could not fully resolve, the extent of the arrangement. The distinction between what was confirmed through legal proceedings, what was established through parliamentary investigation, and what remained alleged but unproven became a central feature of that period's political discourse in Colombia. This ambiguity was not accidental. The Cali organization was dismantled through coordinated Colombian and American law enforcement action in the mid-1990s. Its principal leaders cooperated with American investigators, providing information about their own networks in exchange for reduced sentences. What they described was an organization that had spent years building not a criminal empire, but a business ecosystem, one in which the criminal nature of its core activity was insulated by layers of legitimate activity that provided both cover and genuine profit. Medellín proved a cartel could terrorize a state. Cali proved something worse. It could blend into one. No shootouts, no headlines, just signatures. The cleanest crime scene is the one that looks like governance. Different continents, different languages, different methods. The same architecture? A gap in institutions, a structure that fills it, and a political system that finds the arrangement tolerable until it doesn't. Because by now, the question isn't whether these empires exist. It's how many institutions learn to live with them. On the other side of the world, organized crime took a form that challenged most of the analytical categories developed from studying Western examples. In Japan, crime became an institution. The Fifth Empire had offices and business cards. Some had headquarters you could photograph legally. In Japan, crime wasn't always hidden. Sometimes it was filed. And when crime has a filing cabinet, it stops being deviant. It becomes administrative. The Yakuza, a collective term for several large Japanese organized crime federations, most notably the Yamaguchi-gumi, Sumiyoshi-kai, and Inagawa-kai, did not operate in shadows the way their counterparts in Italy or Colombia did. The largest Yakuza organizations maintained formal headquarters with signage. They published internal newsletters. Their leadership structures were, in some cases, publicly known. This transparency was not naivety. It was a strategic positioning that reflected the specific historical and cultural context in which the Yakuza had developed. Following the devastation of World War II, Japanese civil society was fractured. Black markets operated extensively. The American Occupation Administration, focused on political and economic reconstruction, had neither the capacity nor the consistent intention to dismantle informal economic structures, providing basic goods and services in a period of severe shortage. The Yakuza filled gaps. They controlled black markets. They provided enforcement in disputes that formal courts could not efficiently resolve. And critically, according to Japanese sociological and criminological scholarship, they positioned themselves as guardians of social order against leftist labor movements, a positioning that made them useful to certain conservative political and business interests during the post-war Reconstruction period. That positioning created durable relationships. By the high-growth decades of the 1960s and 1970s, the Yakuza had diversified into construction, real estate, financial services, entertainment, and nightlife. The construction sector relationship was particularly significant large infrastructure projects, particularly those involving land acquisition in contested areas, frequently relied on Yakuza-connected intermediaries to resolve disputes and manage opposition. At the time, none of this seemed unusual. Japanese law did not prohibit organized crime membership until 1992. Prior to that, the organizations operated in a legal gray zone that allowed significant economic activity that would have been prosecuted elsewhere. The 1991 collapse of Japan's asset bubble produced a specific interaction with Yakuza-connected financial activity. Certain Japanese financial institutions had extended credit to real estate projects with Yakuza affiliations during the bubble period. When those assets collapsed, the management of non-performing loans became entangled with organizations that were not responsive to ordinary financial workout procedures. The institutional entanglement was documented. Its full extent remained partially obscured by the same relationships that had allowed it to develop. The pattern here was not corruption in the ordinary sense. It was institutional normalization, the gradual integration of criminal organizations into economic structures in ways that made disruption costly for legitimate actors who had no criminal intent, but whose interests had become aligned with the preservation of existing arrangements. When crime becomes institutional, it becomes difficult to distinguish from authority. When an institution learns to live with crime, crime learns to live forever. If the Yakuza represented organized crime as cultural institution, the organization that came to be recognized as perhaps the most globally significant criminal network of the late 20th century, represented something fundamentally different. The Sixth Empire built itself on silence and blood. The Ndrangheta, based in Calabria, the southernmost region of the Italian mainland, had existed in recognizable form since the late 19th century. For most of that time, it was regarded by Italian law enforcement and political institutions as a regional phenomenon less sophisticated than the Sicilian Mafia, less nationally significant than the Camorra. This assessment proved to be substantially wrong. The Ndrangheta's organizational architecture was built around something that proved extraordinarily difficult for law enforcement to penetrate: blood. Where the Sicilian Cosa Nostra recruited externally and used ritual initiation to bind members to the organization, the Ndrangheta's core units called Ndrangheta were built around family structures. Membership was primarily, though not exclusively, hereditary. The organization was, in effect, a federation of extended families, each controlling a specific territory and economic sector, and connected to other families through marriage alliances. This structure had a specific operational consequence. Informants who infiltrated the organization were almost always detected, because genuine membership required family connections that outsiders could not fabricate. The Pentatei model that had produced significant results against the Sicilian Mafia was far less effective against an organization where trust was encoded in genealogy rather than ritual. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the Ndrangheta expanded its international presence in ways that Italian authorities did not initially track systematically. Calabrian immigrants to Germany, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere maintained organizational connections that allowed the network to establish nodes in European and international narcotics distribution chains. The investigators were looking for a criminal organization. What they found eventually was a family that had gone international. The Ndrangheta became, by the late 20th century and into the 21st, the dominant wholesale cocaine importer into Europe, a position documented in Europol assessments and Italian Parliamentary Anti-Mafia Commission reports. This happened quietly. There were no wars against governments. There were no dramatic assassinations of prosecutors. There was, instead, a patient geographic expansion that took advantage of migrant communities, diaspora networks, and the limited capacity of national law enforcement agencies to coordinate across borders. If Cosa Nostra was a state within a state, then Ndrangheta was a family within the law. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply extends its reach while attention is directed elsewhere. It wasn't expansion, it was inheritance across borders. In Naples, organized crime took a form that defied the structural models developed by analysts studying the Sicilian Mafia or the American Commission. The Seventh Empire had no center. That was its strength. The Camorra was not, and is not, a single organization. It was, and remains, a fluid assemblage of competing clans operating across the Naples metropolitan area and the surrounding Campania region. Some clans were large and stable. Others were small and volatile. Alliances formed and dissolved on timelines driven by economic opportunity and interpersonal conflict rather than by centralized strategic calculation. This fragmentation was initially misread as weakness. It was not weakness. In a dense urban environment with chronic unemployment, a fragmented economy, and a history of inadequate state service provision, the Camorra's dispersed structure was actually adaptive. No single law enforcement action could decapitate the organization because there was no single organization to decapitate. When a major clan was disrupted, others absorbed its territory and personnel. The economic sectors controlled by various Camorra clans included construction, waste disposal, food distribution, counterfeit goods manufacturing, and narcotics. The waste disposal sector became, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a subject of significant investigative attention. According to investigations documented by Italian prosecutors, and reporting by journalist Roberto Saviano, who subsequently lived under police protection. As a result of that reporting, certain Camorra-connected entities had entered into arrangements with industrial and commercial waste producers to dispose of hazardous materials illegally. Public health literature and resident accounts from the Campania region have described elevated rates of certain illnesses in affected communities, though the precise causal relationships remain subject to ongoing scientific study. The scale of illegal waste disposal in the area was not a secret within affected communities. It was a fact of local life. The institutional response was fragmented, inadequately resourced, and periodically undermined by the same local political and administrative relationships that had allowed the problem to develop. Saviano documented the Camorra's operations in a 2006 book. The response was a credible death threat. In some regions, telling the truth required police protection. Keeping silent required nothing. Silence isn't passive. Silence is an agreement. The documented reaction to documentation was itself a form of data. Across the Pacific, the organizational model developed by Chinese Triad societies presented a further variation on the question of how criminal structures achieve durability. The Eighth Empire had no headquarters, it had a network. The Triad societies with roots in 18th century resistance movements in Qing Dynasty China had, by the 20th century, evolved into organized crime networks operating primarily through diaspora communities in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and Chinese communities across North America, Europe, and Australia. Their organizational architecture was neither the centralized hierarchy of the American Mafia nor the family cell structure of the Ndrangheta. It was, more precisely, a network of affiliated but operationally independent cells sharing ritual traditions, communication protocols, and mutual recognition. The consequence was simple. The Triads were extremely difficult to dismantle through conventional law enforcement approaches because there was no central leadership whose removal would collapse the network. Prosecuting a Triad cell in Vancouver did not materially weaken a Triad cell in Sydney. Hong Kong, during the British colonial period, developed a complex institutional relationship with Triad activity. The Independent Commission Against Corruption, established in 1974, specifically targeted corruption that had allowed Triad operations to function with police accommodation. The ICAC's early operations produced evidence of systematic corruption at multiple levels of the police hierarchy corruption that had, according to the Commission's findings, become institutionalized over decades. When the people enforcing the law start selling it, crime stops being underground. It becomes policy. The ICAC investigations were significant, not because they fully eliminated the problem, but because they documented how an institution designed to enforce the law had developed internal arrangements that protected the activities it was supposed to suppress. This wasn't a few bad actors. It was a system learning to tolerate itself. Their role in narcotics trafficking, particularly heroin flowing from Southeast Asian production regions through Hong Kong transit routes, was documented extensively in DEA and international law enforcement reporting through the 1970s and 1980s. What was harder to document, and what remained partially unresolved in the investigative record, was the full extent of Triad penetration into legitimate financial and business structures across the diaspora communities in which they operated. Geographic and sectoral adaptation. An organization that survived sustained pressure not by defeating it, but by relocating around it. In Mexico, the late 20th century produced a criminal organization that would serve as the template for subsequent narco-federations that became a defining feature of early 21st century security discourse. The Ninth Empire didn't seize territory, it organized it. The Guadalajara Cartel, operating in the 1980s under loose coordination among several trafficking figures, was not Mexico's first drug trafficking organization. Cannabis had been produced and exported from Mexico for decades, with varying degrees of official accommodation and enforcement depending on political circumstances. What the Guadalajara structure added was coordination. Prior to this model, Mexican trafficking operated through fragmented regional groups with no mechanisms for territory allocation, conflict resolution, or shared investment. The result was significant volatility and economic inefficiency. The Guadalajara structure created a coordinating mechanism that managed competition, allocated routes, shared protection investments, and standardized certain operational procedures. The specific catalyst was the expansion of Colombian cocaine transshipment through Mexico, as American interdiction efforts reduced the direct Caribbean routes used by Colombian organizations. The American dimension of this story is documented but contested in its specific details. According to investigations by the U.S. Senate's Kerry Committee and subsequent investigative journalism, certain officials in U.S. agencies operating in Central America and Mexico during the period were aware of, or intersected with, arrangements involving narcotics trafficking arrangements justified internally by Cold War political priorities. The specific extent of official knowledge and accommodation remains disputed in the historical record. What is confirmed through subsequent prosecutorial proceedings in Mexico and American courts is that the Guadalajara network operated for an extended period with a degree of protection from Mexican federal police and political figures. In 1985, DEA agent Enrique Camarena was kidnapped, tortured, and killed in Guadalajara. The killing produced a significant rupture in U.S.-Mexico relations. American judicial proceedings produced evidence of protection relationships between Mexican police and the Guadalajara network that the Mexican government did not publicly acknowledge. The Guadalajara structure fractured after 1989 when its principal coordinator was arrested by Mexican federal police. The fracture was not a dismantling. It was a decentralization. The regional trafficking organizations that emerged in Sinaloa, in Tijuana, in the Gulf, carried forward the coordination template while operating with greater independence. The competition between them generated violence that, by the early 21st century, produced casualty figures that required journalists and researchers to develop new analytical frameworks. The foundation had been built decades earlier, and once the blueprint exists, anyone can copy it. The final chapter of 20th century criminal empire architecture was written not in conditions of prosperity, but in conditions of collapse. The 10th Empire didn't need revolution, it needed opportunity. When the Soviet Union dissolved between 1989 and 1991, it did not simply lose territory. It lost the institutional infrastructure, the enforcement mechanisms, the regulatory systems, the distributed authority structures that had, for all their dysfunction, maintained a particular kind of social order. Into the space created by that institutional evacuation moved a range of actors, entrepreneurs, former state officials, intelligence service veterans, and organized criminal networks. An empty factory floor in 1992, a new owner on paper, the same men at the gate. The Russian Bratva, a collective term covering multiple regional criminal organizations that emerged from Soviet-era criminal subcultures, was not a unified organization in the way Western analyses of organized crime typically assumed. It was a dispersed ecosystem of groups with varying structures, varying geographic footprints, and varying relationships with what remained of state authority. What unified these groups was not organizational affiliation. It was shared opportunity. The privatization of Soviet state assets, factories, resource extraction operations, transportation infrastructure, financial institutions proceeded through a process that was inadequately regulated and susceptible to systematic manipulation. Assets moved at below market valuations. The ability to influence official decisions provided decisive advantage. Criminal organizations with access to capital, much of it generated through extortion, narcotics, and weapons trafficking during the late Soviet period, were positioned to participate in these transfers. So were former officials who had accumulated influence relationships during their state careers. In many cases, these two categories overlapped. The result was a specific configuration criminal organizations that became, through the privatization process, partially legitimate economic actors, while legitimate economic actors who had participated in the same process often operated through methods that would not survive scrutiny. This structural ambiguity, the deliberate blurring of the distinction between criminal and legitimate economic activity, became a defining feature of post-Soviet Russian business culture in the 1990s. Western financial institutions, in this period, extended credit, managed assets, and facilitated transactions for clients from the former Soviet space without always applying the level of due diligence standard for domestic clients. Competitive pressure, limited information, regulatory lag. Three conditions, exploited simultaneously, on an industrial scale. By the late 1990s, Western law enforcement and regulatory agencies were documenting capital flight from Russia through correspondent banking relationships, offshore structures in Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands and the Channel Islands, and real estate investments in major metropolitan markets. A bank transfer routed through 3 countries before the paperwork even catches up. By the time the compliance officer flagged it, the money had already arrived. Investigations by the U.S. Senate, Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and European banking regulators suggested that the problem was not peripheral to the Russian financial system. It was structural. The Russian organized crime networks that developed in the 1990s are not best understood as criminal organizations that achieved economic success. They are better understood as the economic expression of a state that had, for a period, been unable or unwilling to maintain the distinction between criminal and legitimate economic activity within its own borders. Where the state retreated, other structures advanced. Collapse doesn't erase rules. It just changes who writes them. What remains after a century of evidence is a specific observation. Criminal organizations do not create the conditions for their own existence. They inherit conditions that already exist, conditions of institutional weakness, economic inequality, regulatory failure, and political accommodation that develop through processes that are rarely deliberate and almost never acknowledged by the institutions involved. The reforms that followed each of the cases examined in this documentary were real. The Maxi trial in Italy, RICO prosecutions in the United States, the dismantling of the Medellín and Cali cartels, enhanced anti-Yakuza legislation in Japan, the ICAC in Hong Kong. Each produced measurable results. None produced finality, because the structural conditions that produce organized crime are not generated by criminal organizations. They are generated by the same institutional failures, the same economic inequalities, and the same political accommodations that make every other form of structural corruption possible. Every empire examined tonight was built from a gap. Not a gap in law, a gap in will. Dismantling an organization addresses the symptom. The conditions that produced it require a different kind of attention. That attention, historically, arrives late. And the most expensive lie a state can tell itself is this: that accommodation is stability. It is not. It is simply instability that has agreed to be quiet. For now.